On today's episode of the Dig In podcast, we're joined by Dr. Dylan Johnson, an ancient Near Eastern historian and biblical scholar from Cardiff University. He's an expert in Semitic languages and ancient legal traditions from Mesopotamia, Syria, and Israel. His research is featured in major academic journals, and he's a frequent guest on the History Channel's podcast, The History Hit. Today, he helps us uncover the real-world context behind the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's dig in. All right, so now I got to bring you over to here because when I heard you walk through this on the History Hit podcast, it was just awesome. And the question was, take us through Sodom and Gomorrah. What is the biblical narrative, though, but from this historical aspect of it? So let's kind of bring our readers through the story, the listeners through the story.
Right. So most people are going to read the biblical text from start to finish, more or less. So where we encounter the key narratives, the stories about Sodom and Gomorrah, are essentially in two places in the book of Genesis. Once in chapter 14, and then a second time in chapters 18 through 19. And they're completely different stories. The only commonality is that they both talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and more or less the kind of geographical space around them. And there's clearly some degree of correlation between the two, most notably through the figure of Lot. This is Abraham's kinsman, who is really the Israelites' connection to these cities. So right. I guess we can start with the story most people will know. Most people would associate with Sodom and Gomorrah, which is not the first one in chapter 14, but rather the stories in chapters 18 and 19, which are actually kind of two stories that are combined. So chapter 18 begins with this episode, which takes place at the Oaks of Mamre. So this is not, in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's somewhere in Israel, Palestine, somewhere in there. And it's where this patriarch, Abraham at this point, lives with his family. And it's a story of a divine visit. And it begins with these three men, and they're called men in Hebrew initially. And they show up at the house of Abram and his wife, Sarah. And this sparks a very short episode about guest hospitality. And this is really important because this becomes a key theme for interpreting ultimately the sin of Sodom.
The hospitality aspect of it, right?
Hospitality, right. Exactly. And in chapter 18, Abraham and his wife Sarah are, paragons of what you're supposed to do when guests come. These are not just, mom and dad visiting for the weekend. These are unknown people who you don't recognize, and what you're supposed to do for the treatment of strangers. And it's not very complicated what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to give them lodging, give them food, and protect them, basically, from whatever exists outside of the home. And what happens when you do follow hospitality rites properly, and this is almost a universal feature of human societies, is that oftentimes you're blessed. And the blessing comes specifically in the form of a promise of a child. And this is very important for the biblical authors because sure. This is the line of Israel. This is how the Israelites perpetuate. And so these are revealed at a certain point in that episode. One of them, at least, is revealed to be God himself. And because Abraham and his wife showed the proper guest rites, God promises Sarah a son. The son would become Isaac. And so this is an episode that actually plays out a few times in Scripture about what you're supposed to do. If you follow the proper rites, then you're blessed. And so that's the good part of the story, right? That's chapter 18. Right. And then the narrative shifts suddenly. And the narrative shifts and starts talking about these two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, as more or less places of sin. And this will be a key theme, sin. What is the sin? And it doesn't get very specific in chapter 18. It just says that they're extremely sinful and that God is planning to destroy them. Right. And then what happens is there's this really interesting dialogue between Abraham and God, where Abraham actually challenges God, trying to get to the morality of destroying an entire city based on just how many righteous people are in the city that would allow it to be spared. And they kind of have a back and forth, which gets, I think, into some interesting theological questions about, questioning God and the morality of all of these things. Sure. And basically, God relents and says, okay, if you can go and find so many righteous people within this city, then I won't destroy it. Well, spoiler alert, they don't find very many righteous people in this city. And what happens at the end of chapter 18 and what moves into chapter 19 is these other two guests, these two men, are revealed to be angels, messengers. The Hebrew word is malachim, but not human beings, essentially. And these two other guests are the ones that go to Sodom. They meet with Abraham's kinsman Lot in the city. And the exact antithesis to what Abraham and Sarah had done in terms of guest rights is what the Sodomites do, which is, and this is the key debate about what is the quintessential sin of Sodom, is these two angels, messengers appear in the house of Lot. Lot does follow the proper hospitality rites, feeds them, brings them into his home. But then the Sodomites show up and demand that Lot send these two men out into the square, and then this quintessential biblical euphemism, so that we may know them, which spurns a whole cavalcade of interpretations that the fundamental sin of Sodom is sexual immorality of some kind.
Sure.
And this will kind of be an important interpretation of what's the story about. Is it just about that particular episode, or is it the larger theme of, I guess, the violation of guest rights? And they're kind of connected actually in the story. Anyway, ultimately, the question is not really relevant because Lot refuses. These are also angels, so they manage to ferry Lot and his family out of the city of Sodom to a nearby town called Zoar. And then we get the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Fire and brimstone rains down upon the city, and it's desolated, essentially. And then, of course, we have this kind of enigmatic reference to Lot's wife turning back and turning into a pillar of salt, which has also spawned a myriad of interpretations. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the key narrative that most people would probably know.
So who do they think wrote this, right? Because it's not, one of the things we teach over here, just in the Bible, is that the Bible is not God dictated, it's God breathed. And there's a big difference on that. Like God's not grabbing, God's not placing a phone call to Hosea going, hey, Hosea, listen, I need you to write this down exactly as I'm saying it. But that there's a humanity to the scriptures. Yeah. And we teach this redemptive arc, right? The sin of Adam and Eve, separation from God, and we see the finished work in Christ. And so that you see God breathing on things, or God inspiring things that gets us closer to the finished work of Christ. That's kind of what we see and what we teach in there. But we know, like, we're in the book of Genesis here. It's not like all these things are happening and there's like this scribe following people around writing everything that's going down. So what's the common thought on who wrote this part?
Right. So the simple answer is it was an Israelite. Some Israelite wrote this. And tradition holds that that Israelite would have been Moses, because there is a scriptural reference to Moses writing. The question is, that's an interpretation of scripture, because it's not exactly explicit that says Moses wrote Genesis.
Right.
It's more explicit that says Moses wrote Deuteronomy. But Genesis, it's not as clear, because again, Moses isn't alive at this point in the narrative. So from historical critical scholars, the best bet we can get at is the type of language that the scribes writing with, because there are certain features, just like you and I, we have our own kind of idiosyncrasies when we write. Yeah. So too did ancient scribes. They use particular words. They have specific ideas. And so in a different generation of scholarship, we used to think we could really pinpoint sources, what's called the Yahwist source, the Elohist source, priestly source, that we could at least pinpoint to a specific group, a group of priests, a group of, well, they're probably all priests, but some specific group. That's starting to kind of fall by the wayside now. Now we look more kind of a fragmentary approach to it, that this text or these two chapters were written by some group, probably associated with Jerusalem for reasons we'll get to probably later. And again, it would have to be a fairly elite group, because literacy rates were extremely low in antiquity.
Makes sense.
Which leaves us kind of with the palace or the temple. Those are the two major kind of institutions we think of where writing's going on. And beyond that, it's just guesswork. It could be either. These stories obviously have religious importance, but again, there's no reason that a palace scribe couldn't have written them as well. Beyond that, we can't get too specific, nor can we get too specific with time frames. Right. Generally speaking, we think somewhere between the 9th and 6th century BCE. That's when we think these texts were written. But that's a pretty wide range of time. And that's about it. That's about all we can say with any degree of certainty about who wrote it.
Yeah, that's got to be so hard to pinpoint people, places that like times like that without,
Yeah.
because there's so little on there. So,
Yeah.
all right, I guess like just staying on this, what do we know about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah outside of the Bible, if anything, really? Are there similar themes or cities that show up in Mesopotamian or Syrian texts that kind of parallel or relate to? So, what do we know about this? Because I know this is also a topic in Christian circles as well.
Yeah, so the basic storyline here of cities of sin that are then destroyed for various affronts, either directly by divine actors or indirectly by human actors being driven by a god or the gods or something. There's a fair number of examples. Cities are destroyed all the time in the ancient world. But there is a little, and I mentioned this previously, there's something a bit unique in the way that the story is told. Typically in, let's say, the Mesopotamian myths, we have stories about the destructions of cities, but usually it's a human agent that's causing the destruction. Now they're driven by gods or goddesses who abandon their cities, but direct destruction of the city by the gods is actually not that common. In fact, ironically, the most closest parallel are the myths of Atlantis in Greek tradition, where it's
Right.
Directly the gods themselves who destroy the city, never to be found again. So that's kind of the myth I point to, is that's kind of the closest parallel. But again, in this world, I like to say there's pretty much no such thing as an atheist. Everything happened because your God or the gods willed it. It's just
Right.
how they explained and understood the world in which they lived. Why did you get sick? You must have sinned. You must have done
Right.
something
Right.
wrong, right? Why did the crops fail? You didn't pray to the God. You didn't pray to God. You didn't pray to the right God. So it's so ubiquitous that it's actually kind of hard to just narrow down a single parallel.
Interesting. What about the Sodom and Gomorrah outside of the scriptures, like the referencing of, because I know there's been some like digs. I know it's controversial within the circles when I'm looking at pictures of sulfur balls, and then other people are disputing those claims. What do we know about Sodom and Gomorrah from outside of the text?
Right. So once we leave the scripture, we have a couple places we can turn, as I mentioned. So one place we can turn is extra biblical sources, Near Eastern sources. And we don't have a lot. We thought we had some for a while from an ancient city called Ebla that mentioned a couple places that looked kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah, but
Okay.
we didn't really understand those texts. Now that we do, they're probably talking about places in Syria, so not in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, not in that area.
Okay.
So textually, we have the Bible. Archaeologically, there's been a lot of suggestions. So I think the most concerted effort to try and locate these cities, it happened in the 1970s with a couple of archaeologists named Rast and Schaub, and they did archaeological surveys all around the area just to the south of the Dead Sea.
Okay.
The reason this is important is because the biblical narratives about Sodom and Gomorrah mention very, very frequently the strange geology of the region, right? And I mean, it's one of the key themes. It's the end of the story that these places are destroyed and turned into basically inhospitable wastelands. Furnace is one of the words, sulfur, fire. I don't know if any of your viewers have ever visited the Dead Sea region. It is a very strange place. It's a very, very strange geological place. It's extremely hot, incredibly salty, obviously, with sulfur deposits. And so it makes sense then if we're trying to find these places, or at least the places that inspire the stories, to go to that area. And this is exactly where Rast and Schaub went. And sure enough, they found sites. People did live in these places, more or less in the time frame that we could imagine the stories having taken place. And the time frames we're thinking of is maybe the third millennium or something like that, the late third millennium BCE. But again, it's so challenging because we have names and narratives, and what we find archaeologically are ruins of foundations. So
Right.
what tells us that this specific site was Sodom and this specific site was Gomorrah?
Right.
And by the way, there's not just two, right? In the biblical narratives, there's actually 5 sites. There's Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and then the Zoar. And so how are we supposed to tell the difference between them when there are no texts? Because essentially, when we identify biblical sites, and we have identified a lot of biblical sites, the key to finally definitively saying this is this site is to find a text there that mentions the name of the city.
Right.
We can sometimes do good guesswork, say, well, it's this distance between these two settlements, so it's probably this. But the smoking gun that we need is a text that's saying it, and we're not going to find it there. So what Rast and Schaub found were sites that were destroyed by factors we don't really know, whether it was earthquakes or armies coming through. And they kind of ultimately said, we have Bronze Age settlements in this region, and the connection then to the biblical narrative would be these ruins would have been visible at the time that biblical writers lived. They could have encountered them in the landscape, and you can kind of imagine what a biblical writer would have thought. You walk into this really hellish landscape, which is completely inhospitable in the time period that I'm talking about, these biblical stories being written, and you find ruins there. So then you can imagine they start to think, well, what happened to these places? What could they have possibly done to turn this landscape into this?
Right, and like how did they anger the gods?
Right, exactly. The wrath of God must have punished these people. And think of how sinful they must have been to have the entire landscape destroyed this way. Because the region around Israel and Palestine and Jordan, it's actually fairly fertile. It's not like the whole area is just this desert that they grow crops and things there. So it would have stood out to ancient peoples too. So there's those archaeological excavations. They tried to identify them. Maybe there's a lot of sites. And then again, there's this other site actually to the north of the Dead Sea, Hammam, excuse me. This was a much more recent suggestion. This was from Evangelical University in Texas, I think, Trinity University. And they suggested this site. The site is a little bit later in time frame than those sites to the south of the Dead Sea. And they actually partnered with this association, the scientific group that tried to explain the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah through kind of natural phenomena, and specifically this idea of this airburst of a comet coming in, basically like exploding above the landscape, and that the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah are just ancient interpretations of this natural phenomenon that occurred. And unfortunately, they didn't do a very good job at trying to explain why it would be this site. And in fact, other people think it's a different biblical site that Tel El Hammam is, which is Abel Shittim. A very important biblical site as well. This is the place where the Israelites allegedly encamped before entering the Promised Land. It's where Moses may have delivered, essentially the book of Deuteronomy. So it's just as an important site. But these are the kind of debates we have, right? So if it's not Sodom, what other biblical city could it be? And so the short answer is archaeologically, we can't tell. We can't find it in the landscape.
Gotcha. You mentioned something that I thought was fascinating. Like I never put two and two together before. It's one of those like duh moments, to be honest with you. And that is Sodom and Gomorrah. Gomorrah is always mentioned with Sodom, never outside of Sodom. But yet we see Sodom mentioned plenty of times individually. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I don't have a definitive answer, but it's very clear that first off, there's no story about Gomorrah. So that nothing happens in Gomorrah, but it's frequently paired with Sodom, but not always. Gomorrah only ever appears with Sodom, but Sodom appears on its own. So what that says to me is that there's a tradition about Sodom, first and foremost, narratives about it, and Gomorrah just kind of tags along. But there's no independent stories about Gomorrah. Why these two get paired, I have no idea. It goes right from the very beginning. These two are paired, it seems, from the earliest stories. And they're not alone. There's also another pair, Admah and Zeboim. These are other cities of the plain. They're also presumably destroyed alongside them. And what's interesting is Admah and Zeboim are sometimes mentioned without Sodom and Gomorrah in prophetic texts and sometimes in texts from the Pentateuch. So the short answer is I think we have circulating independent stories about Admah and Zeboim, stories about Sodom and Gomorrah, and at a certain point, they all kind of coalesce that it becomes one singular story. But I can't prove any of this because I'd need to see the independent stories on their own, which unless we find some more Dead Sea Scrolls or something that shows them separate, all we have is the biblical text. So that's kind of my best guess. But honestly, I don't know why Gomorrah kind of gets pinned on to Sodom in the way that it does, especially since it seems to have no real independent narratives on its own. And that's just one of those mysteries.
Right. Man, if you're going to get paired with anything in the Bible, getting paired to Sodom,
Right.
It's not really.
Right.
It's like,
Well, I mean, it's fairly common. I mean, Sodom, and we can kind of get into this. Sodom becomes the archetype of sin and sanction. Cities that sin and then terrible things happen to them. So Sodom gets paired with pretty much every city that is worthy of destruction. Of course, the enemies of Israel, Babylon and Nineveh, but also Israel itself, Samaria and Jerusalem are routinely identified with Sodom
yeah,
as
what?
places of sin, right?
Yeah, you can expand on that because that is Why is that? Just is it referencing judgment? Are they using it as like a like are they using Sodom as the base story as like you're just like how we see in the Book of Revelation or different things where it's like, oh, you've been seduced by Jezebel. Well, we know Jezebel in the Book of Revelation is not walking around seducing the churches, but almost like using her, the way she manifested, the way she lived her life, the way she talked, spoke, the things she done. Is that similar to Sodom? Like, hey, Sodom got judged by God, and so now every enemy that's going to be judged by God is now Sodom in their eyes?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it becomes the archetype of sin. Is the and every calamity after this, whether that's happening in the present or projecting to the future, especially in the Gospels, it becomes the thing to compare to. And what's interesting, especially with when we get into the prophetic text, it's again routinely the cities of Judah and Israel that are compared to Sodom. But they tend to relent. They tend to say, listen, something terrible is going to come to Jerusalem. You've all sinned. We're going to be destroyed. But unlike Sodom, and this is a refrain usually, there'll be a remnant. It won't be
Right.
completely annihilated. It won't be forgotten and become a wasteland forever. There's a chance for renewal, at least for Jerusalem. That's usually the refrain. What's interesting, especially in the prophetic text, is they can't seem to agree on, well, what was that sin? What was that fundamental sin that made it that made Sodom so irredeemably wicked that it had to be destroyed? So we have the
Right.
narratives, right? And people have focused intensely on the narratives, especially that episode where the Sodomites demand these angels be released so that they may know them. So certainly that becomes a fixation of some later writers. The book of Jude, for instance, seems to think that sexual immorality of some kind, that's the fundamental sin of Sodom. And that really becomes the predominant view. But what's interesting, what I was saying, is that that's not uniformly accepted. If you read Ezekiel, for instance, the book of Ezekiel in chapter 26, I think, let me just make sure I have the right, 16, excuse me. In Ezekiel 16, Ezekiel seems to have no cognizance or awareness that there was any kind of sexual misconduct going on in Sodom. Sodom's sin was hubris, gluttony, over extravagance. And that's the reason that this city becomes destroyed. And then, of course, we have our narratives that say, well, it's also about hospitality. These people violated these hospitality rights. So we have across the biblical narratives, across the biblical texts, whether they're narratives or not, kind of different interpretations of exactly what that sin was. One thing that they all agree on, with the exception of Genesis 14, is that Sodom was sinful and it got what it deserved.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, fascinating. Wow. I know you're expert too in the ancient Near East. Is there any dominant legal or maybe cultural values that could maybe better help us understand how this story was shaped? Is there any of those ideologies that kind of seeped into the Jewish narrative of the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yeah, I think I don't know if it's legal. It would be, I think, custom. So custom would be those unwritten rules, the way that we know that we're supposed to behave. Why do you hold the door open for someone coming in behind you? But even more so, the way that you're supposed to act, whether or not you could be, prosecuted in a court of law for it, that's beside the point. But just ethics and morality and how you're supposed to act, not just with people, but not with people but also with strangers. And
Sure.
I think that's a really key part of this story as well, is that these are strangers, and strangers in the ancient world are extremely vulnerable. There's no, they don't have rights, they don't have protections. And so it becomes incumbent upon people who live in places that you're supposed to protect them. And this again becomes a very prominent theme in the biblical legal texts. Remember, you yourselves were sojourners in the land of Egypt, so you should protect sojourners who come to you, right? So in some level, it I guess corresponds to that idea of protection of the marginal, and certainly this seems to be part of Ezekiel's understanding of the Sodom and Gomorrah story, that they didn't protect the weak and the needy. So Ezekiel takes it that way. That's what the story is about. Jude takes it another direction. And when then you get into the Gospels again, they pick up on more so this comparison theme that you see in the prophets, that, for as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah was, so too were all of these different cities that these gospel writers are railing against. Capernaum and Bethsaida, for as bad as Sodom was, you're even worse, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, I wish I could give you more consistency, but the scripture's not consistent and is open then to these interpretations within itself and also for contemporary peoples.
Right. We see the story as layered, symbolic, evolving. You mentioned a couple of these instances. Are there any more instances where you could walk us through how different scribes or communities have kind of shaped the story over time?
Yeah. So the one episode that I've completely left out is chapter 14 of the book of Genesis. Okay. And I think very few people, when they think of Sodom and Gomorrah, have much awareness of what's going on in that story, because in that story, there is no sin, there is no sanction, and the stories are about a military conflict between these strange kings to the east, and they have some very fantastical names like Chedorlaomer and Amraphel and various names. And the short, to make a long story short, we don't know where any of these people are. We don't know any of these kingdoms. We know some of the kingdoms, and they're kingdoms of the east. Elam, which is in Iran, Shinar, which is basically in Iraq, and then a couple places we don't know. But to just show you that Sodom is a tradition and not just a story, these stories also are interested in the strange landscape of the Dead Sea region. It talks about, sulfur and bitumen pits and all of these things. And it also talks about the destruction of these cities, not because of some fundamental sinfulness and not because it was a divine judgment, but because these armies essentially come from the east and they destroy these cities of the plain. So what do you do with that narrative?
Yeah.
And you have this other story, chapter 18 and 19, and then you have all these later references in the prophets. And some prophets seem to know 18, 19. Some prophets seem to know 14. And some seem to know both. Okay. That doesn't mean that they didn't know individuals. It's just what they talked about. So if they're using Sodom as an archetype of sin, they're not going to talk about kings of the east coming and destroying them, because that's not present in that narrative. But what we have to do as historical critical biblical scholars is not simply read everything as a unified whole, to accept the fact that there might be different traditions on specific themes, on specific places. Right? So not everything said about Shiloh or Jerusalem has to be telling the same story, right? So too with Sodom. If Sodom existed at one point, presumably there's different stories about it. So this is why we think there's layers, or at least different perspectives on what the city represents. And so the challenge and one of the key differences between how historians approach it is, we'll just let the text disagree, and we'll accept the fact that not every story has to have the encompassing narrative in mind when they're talking about these places. And it becomes challenging once you read them, because once you read chapter 18 and 19, every time you see Sodom, you're thinking of that story, which is what they're probably intentional. And clearly some are. But I think the challenge is to let it become unfamiliar again. And that's one of the things I challenge my students to do, especially students who are really steeped in scripture. That they know it too well sometimes. And I say, okay, just let it become a little unfamiliar, and you can start to read it in different ways and come up with newer interpretations.
Right. It's almost like zooming out, like of a map, right? You're so zoomed in. And when you zoom out, you're like, oh, all this additional information. We do a lot of this. I guess the biggest topic for us at the church where we do this is around the fall of the temple in 70 AD.
Yeah.
And references to the end and the end of the age and all that stuff like that. And when we bring that narrative, we hear this all the time. I've never heard of this before. And it like kind of blows their mind, but it kind of makes all these verses a little more understanding.
Yeah, exactly.
So, to Sodom and Gomorrah, this divine judgment, right? And I guess you hit on this a little bit at the end, especially with your students. How would you invite people to consider the value of a more historical and literary reading versus just I don't want to make it sound like just the biblical narrative, or maybe just the biblical narrative that we've been taught. Like, how would you encourage somebody to read these texts and expand their knowledge on it?
I would invite them to first off read it. Just go read it. Is the first step. Read it for yourself and read it without some kind of commentary or some kind of interpretive guide. You can turn to those afterwards, but just read it for yourself. This is exactly what I tell all of my students. I say, don't just go straight to the articles and books and things and people telling you how you're supposed to interpret it. Right. Read it for yourself and read all of the accounts. And we have these great, resources now where you can just look up the word Sodom and go read every single reference to the place in the Old and the New Testament and see what they're saying about it. See where you can kind of group different trends. Okay, these gospel writers are they're probably reading Isaiah in some way, or they're influenced by Isaiah because they're talking about Sodom in the same way that Isaiah talks about Sodom. Oh, this one seems to be talking about it in the way that Ezekiel is. And you start to see kind of the interconnections and the human aspect behind these traditions, that there are groups of people who are thinking and writing and relating these things, and they're falling into different kind of camps. And then, of course, you're going to have the standouts where I have no idea where this tradition comes from, and just let it stand alone. It doesn't have to all fit together neatly. Right. And so I'd say do that first, and then kind of make up your mind on these other bigger questions. So, okay, it seems to be that sin is an overarching theme, and don't fixate on the same things that other people fixate on, right? So is it about sexual immorality? Well, only 2 texts even mention that. What about all these other texts that mention all these other types of sin, about hubris, about hospitality and things? Is that not an important part of the narrative too? Is that not maybe even the more important part of the narrative? And then once you do that, you come away with a much more nuanced understanding of the story, both in terms of what it's saying, but also in terms of its message. And that's probably more important for your listeners and for the congregants in your church about what the story is trying to teach you. Right. And I think the best way to do that is from the text.
So in your studies, this is a personal question for you. What has surprised you the most, I guess? Like when, you started out at a church, right? You said you were raised in a Christian home in Canada. Is that right? Yeah. If I remember correctly, only an hour ago. And then you went all your travels and your studies. What has surprised you the most, or stayed with you as you explored these ancient stories, these ancient sites, these ancient works, legal frameworks, cultural frameworks, things like that?
Well, I think the first thing is this project of defamiliarization. Is these texts were all very familiar to me from Sunday school and things like that. It's realizing that they are ancient Near Eastern documents, ultimately the products of ancient Near Eastern peoples who are distinct. Now, they're not Babylonians writing these things, but they're part of that world. And what's really interesting is just how much they know about this world and how we can use it historically. So that's really interesting to me about the potentials for biblical memory, which is in fact quite old, and just how old it is. I work with a lot of colleagues who work on ancient Greece. I mean, there's biblical texts that are far older than some of our oldest Greek myths. So first off, the antiquity of this document is really surprising to me. And what it remembers and the detail at which it remembers is very fascinating to me. And I work a little bit with the Dead Sea Scrolls, just how, faithfully they'd been transmitted over the centuries. So we can see at, basically zero, the turn of the era, the Old Testament looks quite a bit like the Old Testament we have now. So it hasn't changed in those 2,000 years. Some differences. Scribes make mistakes, of course.
Sure.
But basically it's the same. So those are the things that really, shocked me and surprised me when I first started. And then working in various different departments. I've worked in a divinity school. I've worked in theological departments. I work in an ancient history department, is how we can bring the biblical text kind of into all these different arenas, how all of these different people with different interests, that's the one thing that kind of brings us all together into discussions. I'm interested in history, but I have many colleagues who work on the theology of the Old Testament, and we have lots to say to each other. So it's very much about, just encouraging dialogue and not thinking that there's only one way to read this text. In fact, there's quite a few different ways to read it.
Right. Well, man, this has been, Dr. Johnson, this has been awesome. And, just talking us through Sodom and Gomorrah, I know that everybody listening is really going to be blessed. A lot of eye-opening things said today, a lot of just really interesting stuff that I'm believing is going to encourage people to study more. Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.